Let us pray. O God, by sharing in the Eucharistic sacrifice, which your Son commanded us to offer as his memorial, may we become one body, one spirit in Christ, and be with him an everlasting gift to you. Through Christ our Lord. Now, if you remember, we left a piece of obedience hanging in the air. We had come exactly to what we might call a difficult superior in the person of Don Castamagna, who we said did not seem to have profited very much from Don Bosco's example. Remember the scene in the little cell in the dormitory at the oratory. And to his own admission, right up to his death, he said it very often, usually after one of his tongue lashings given at random to those who deserved it and to those who did not. He used to say of himself, be patient, I am a bear that not even Don Bosco succeeded to tame. For a short time, and very mercifully so, he was chaplain of the Salesian Sisters in the early years of their institute at Nizza Monferrato. Once, because St. Mary Dominica Mazzarello, the foundress, had changed the schedule without not consulting with him, he publicly gave her such a tongue lashing that the poor soul, sick and sickly, fainted away. The sisters complained bitterly to him. How dare you complain, he told them. You should thank me. It's my way of contributing to her beatification. But it did apologize later to the good sainted mother. Archbishop Pittini was a witness to a scene which, in his own words, he said he will never forget. And here is the story from Pittini's own lips. It happened at an ordination ceremony of several Salesians, of which Bishop Castamagna incidentally succeeded Bishop Caliero in South America. At which ceremony of ordination Bishop Castamagna presided in the chapel of the House of Studies, incidentally, at which future Archbishop Pittini was then director. All was ready in the sacristy for the procession, but for one deacon, a candidate for ordination, who had not arrived from a school far away from Buenos Aires. Your Excellency, I told Bishop Castamagna, Pittini talking, if you don't mind, we will wait a few minutes. But the bishop minded very much. 5 minutes, he said gruffly, and not one more. To gain time, Father Pittini continues, I passed the word to the choir that as the bishop came into the sanctuary, they should keep repeating Ecce sacerdos magnus a few times, and then warn the master of ceremonies to slow down the vesting process. If you remember, in those days the bishop used to vest at the altar with a long ceremony, and a ceremony, to slow down the vesting process of the bishop. But no sight of the missing deacon. The ceremony began, and only some 10 minutes or so later the poor deacon arrived in the sanctuary. The bishop stopped, and out of his episcopal lips came one of his famous tongue lashings, directed to the poor deacon. And on it went, until the young Salesian could stand it no more. In tears, he left the sanctuary and went to the sacristy. Surprised and dumbfounded, The bishop told the master of ceremonies to go and fetch him. How can I be ordained the way I feel now? I can't, the tearful deacon replied. The master of ceremonies relayed the message to the bishop, and then the incredible happened. The bishop left his throne, and with the master of ceremonies walked to the sacristy. He knelt before the young deacon, humbly apologized to him, took him gently by the arm, and together they walked to the sanctuary, where the bishop quietly orders the master of ceremony to place him first on the line of the deacons. Such was Bishop Costamagna, concluded Archbishop Pizzini, a man who was not happy unless he went to extremes in everything he did. And at this point we say, God help us from such men, such superiors, and even such bishops. But let's be fair too. Bishop Costamagna came down his high horse and on his knees apologized humbly to the young deacon. Probably not every superior we have known ever did that. I mean, after admitting to a mistake, humbly apologizing, even as Don Bosco did many times, very openly. And so we say, dear comrades, it is precisely because superiors are human and limited, often self-willed and lacking in vision, that the religious must put his faith to work. Faith led us to the religious life. Without it, surrendering our will to another man, as we do with our obedience, would be simply absurd. Religious life itself would be absurd, and we would be, in the words of St. Paul, the most miserable of men. It is faith that tells us that we actually surrendered our will to God, even though it is in the fragile hands of a man. We know there is a great mystery in obedience. I think the Constitution has a beautiful expression. Our obedience, as of now, continues the obedience of Christ to his Father. Beautiful concept. It means our religious obedience means oneness with Christ's obedience to the will of the Father. This is not, again, any concept of mine. I stole it from the Constitutions. A will sometime obscure, but always in the end a bearer of brightness. Sooner or later we found that it was it. It was the very thing we should have done. But some faith we must also place in men. These superiors are our confreres. Don't let's make life miserable for them. This is what Don Caviglia used to say. After hitting the superiors right and left, as only he could, coming out with expressions that were tremendously sharp, he would end up by saying, blessed mercy on them too. They do not usually occupy their uneasy chairs because they chose to sit on them themselves. Note too that in the new dispensation, by decree, the church, and even the mandate of our own constitutions, by decree, superiors must consult and dialogue with the confreres. This has always been the spirit and tradition in our family. Article 94 of the Constitution is crystal clear. The superior listens to the members and gives due weight to their opinion. It is he who makes the decision. So there is no question that the director is in command, but must never forget that he heads a family. This is the great point. I was just a newly ordained priest, Father Don Philip Rinaldi says. And more than once, as an unexperienced rector of the church of the school of San Giovanni, where Don Bosco placed him, unbelievably, a few months after he was ordained, where Don Bosco was training his sons of Mary, actually, from which group came droves of missionaries, some of the greatest missionaries, like Don Balzola and such, came from that school. Well, he says, more than once, Don Rinaldi is speaking, more than once Don Bosco approached me to ask me, in a very matter-of-course way, what I thought of a given project concerning the school in which I was director. I remember I once felt encouraged to tell him that I did not agree with him on a certain plan he had. Do you know what Don Bosco told me? Philip, I'll do it my way this time, but as if you had been the one to suggest it. Think to what a point Don Bosco went. To dialogue with his confreres. And we think this is just now since the council. If ever a superior, and this we say, had to regret a decision, and I place myself among those superiors, it was when the superior sprang a decision on a confrere or on a community without consultation or dialogue. There is a story about one such director, true story, who made his decision in the privacy of his room, and he said, in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and then proceeded to communicate them with notes to the confreres. Notes. It lasted exactly 1 year. He was a good soul, poor man. He meant well. One evening, just about around this time of the year, the obedience time, at supper, or dinner as we call it here, he tapped the bell towards the end, tapped the glass. It was a fairly large community. He was to tell them that he had gotten a new appointment. So he tapped the glass. Cari confratelli, dear confreres, I must inform you that I have been appointed chaplain of the sisters in Asti. A rousing applause greeted his words. What I mean to say, tap the glass again, is that I must leave you. Another applause. And the man really had never learned to talk with the confreres. He thought he could rule the house with notes, with inspiration from above. So given the warm family climate among us, with superiors we rightly suppose and expect to be fatherly, understanding, and ready to dialogue, obedience for a Salesian should not normally be an impossible hardship. But were it to come to that, we must face it with a true spirit of faith. Note what Saint Benedict, the great patriarch of all religions, what Saint Benedict wrote. The supreme test of the fidelity in a religious. Here it is. 1. Si vere in omnibus querit Deum. If he really seeks God in all he does. 2. Si anacer obedit. If he readily obeys. We always like to give Jesus the last word at these conferences. His is always the best. Vos, amici mei, estis, si feceritis, per principio vobis. I still like my Latin. You are indeed my friends, if you do what I command you. Now this was the piece of obedience hanging in the air. Now we have to go on. But before we do, in his sparkling good night last night, Father Kelleher mentioned, among other confreres of great repute, he mentioned Father Franco and rightly placed him in the class of giants in the Salesian world. In England, for the retreats, many years after Father Franco had left it to come to the States, I was amazed that he was still in the heart and on the lips of every single English and Irish Salesian I met. Well, but I was not astounded when I began to think the best of Don Bosco came through in Father Franco. And if anything, Don Bosco's best human side. Those of you who knew him, and there are at least few of you here, will bear me out. He truly was a fatherly superior, but with a human touch, which is exactly what we had in Don Bosco. I visited him at Piotrasco in Piedmont shortly before he died. He was still valid in mind and spirit, but a total wreck physically. Oh, what a spirit. He said, I am grateful for what was. Grateful as I can never tell you. And then he added, to think that the best is yet to come. And he pointed to heaven. Now these are the men that we should know. What are we doing? I would say, beginning, Father Kelleher, write something about Father Franco, for our sake. I may repeat myself and sound like a broken record on this point. But let me say again that one of the most important contributions to the formation of our young Salesians is a collection of pamphlets portraying such men as left a mark in the society. Again I say they should be short, lively, with a sparkle. Verba movent, we used to say, exempla traum. I'm not against the theory and the rationale behind Salesianity, but I still say that the living, moving example of those magnificent men can do more to inspire a young man than all the theorizing, may he forgive me, of Father Aubry, whom I esteem greatly because I think is one of the best analyzers of Salesianity. But we can lose ourselves in theory. We will never lose ourselves when we have someone before us who personified, incarnated those theories. I was so pleased to see in the Salesian Bulletin this month a magnificent profile of Venerable Prince Czartoryski. Do you know that he and Don Beltrami, Bishop Versilia, and Don Caravaggio are the nearest to canonization, to beatification. We understand fully that Pope John Paul wants Czartoryski blessed soon. And Czartoryski will drag along Beltrami and also Versilia and Caravaggio, because I was told in the Vatican that they do not make saints one at a time anymore. They bunch them up together. It's too much money. So we may soon be having a beatification involving several Salesians. What a beautiful thing. So again I say to writers present and would-be writers, unite and do something about these men, these people. I did something, nothing really on Don Alfonso, as you know, and I made my hand at Father Pinelli, although we lost everything we ever had on Father Pinelli. But these men should really be in the forefront, or else we lose what we should never think of losing. This is awful. Now we have still to begin the subject of the morning. Look, we read it in this magnificent article of the Constitution. Our radical commitment as religious to the God we love above all things serves to purify and enrich our apostolic service. It enables us to announce Christ as the living, giving, as the life-giving Word. We ourselves have experienced in intimate encounter, which means that if we do not experience Him in an intimate encounter, we will be worth nothing. And so, for a title, if you like to call it, of this conversation, centered on Christ. And this happened to be an expression very dear to one of the greatest Benedictines of modern times, Irish-born, Abbot, servant of God, Abbot Columbia Marmion. He was abbot at Maritzu, Belgium. All of his rich spirituality can be summed up in those words, centered on Christ. Father Louis Merton, the Trappist, Belgian-born but American by adoption, took up the theme of Marmion and developed it masterfully in his writings. But we do not have to turn to the wells of Benedictine spirituality to find waters at which to slacken our thirst. We have them right in our own backyard, in our own Salesian milieu. During the year preceding, a few months, and then part also of the novitiate in New Rochelle, at which Father John Romano, Divizzi, and myself were novices, Venerable Bishop Basilia stayed for several months at the provincial house. Most weekends he would be off begging for his missions in China, but for the rest of the time he remained with us, was at our disposal for confession, and gave us an occasional conference. I have told you that in many ways he was a very special person, in the sense that if ever it could be said that the Lord came through in a man, that man was Bishop Brasilia. But mine, he was not pious in the usual connotation of that word. And yet beneath the simple, friendly exterior, one could tell a strong interior force activated his entire existence. It was unquestionably his deep spiritual life, his intimate spirit of prayer and of union with God. When at 6 o'clock in the morning we entered the chapel for meditation, those were the days, don't complain, we would find him kneeling at his place already, occasionally reading his breviary, mostly his hands to his face in prayer. He would be back in the chapel several times a day, and we discovered once even during the night. I remember we had gone to Union City to see the Passion Play. It was March. It was cold, miserable. We got back well after midnight, and some of us dropped in for a visit to the chapel, which, like the dormitory, was on the ground floor. Do you know that the novitiate was actually all comprised in what is now the cafeteria of the high school boys? It was sectioned off, and that was the novitiate. I switched on the light as we entered, and there was Bishop Garcilia kneeling on the steps of the altar in that cold chapel. The man lived what he preached, for in his talks, and particularly during the retreat he preached to us that year, he came back frequently to a familiar thought expressed in the words of St. Paul, Mi vivere Christus est. For me to live is Christ. We must live Christ. Unless we do so, unless we let him live and operate in us, we will never get very far with anything we do. His words. Bishop Versilia stressed the specific character of our vocation, which involves both our consecration to God as religious and our apostolic mission of men who work for the kingdom. We read it in the Constitution. The two are inseparable, but the second, our mission as apostles of the good news, depends on the first, our total consecration to God. I consecrate myself to you, Father, for their sakes, that they may be consecrated in truth. The good bishop made these words from St. John's Gospel the topic of one of his retreat conferences. And when I recently went over some of my notes of that conference, Father Binelli used to tell us that he did not care to see us just listening when such a man as Versilia was talking. He wanted us to take notes. Looking at those notes, I got the feeling that the Article 70 we just read about the encounter with Jesus was actually lifted from what he said. Were Bishop Versilia to sum up that article, he would say every Salesian is meant to be another Christ, that he may become all to all and win all to Christ. No wonder he insisted that unless Jesus lives in us, our work for souls ends in failure, and our own life as religious makes no sense whatever. Comes to that. This is indeed remarkable for a man of Versilia's activity. He was involved in mission work to his neck. But the accomplishments of that man, in less than 15 years, he had opened enough foundations to decide the Holy See to establish a vicariate apostolic, of which he became the first bishop ordinary in Shucha. Chucklin used to tell us that when he was given the cablegram announcing that he had been elevated to the episcopal dignity, he was cleaning the toilets in the school at Shucha, of which he was director. And this sounds even worse than when the story in St. Bonaventure's life. He was washing pots at the monastery kitchen when the Pope's legates came in with a cardinal's hat. Hang it up there, he told them, pointing to a nail on the wall, and went right on washing pots. Now here is a little parenthesis that may sound like a story from paranormal or psychological, but let's give it the credit it deserves, especially coming from such as from whom it comes. Testifying for Bishop Versilia's process of beatification, Bishop Kanadzei, his successor, said that what amazed him in his predecessor was a total lack of self, in the sense that he had emptied himself completely and put on Christ. So I think Bishop Kanadzei, his successor, Versilia's successor, who knew him so intimately, could not thought he had dreamed when he had this unbelievable experience. Shortly before this Bishop Kanadzei died, he revealed a personal experience which he felt had nothing to do with parapsychology or self-hypnosis or the like. Here is the story the way he tells it. I was quite worried over the fact that I could not locate in the bishop's file, shortly after Bishop Versilia was killed, a set of documents relating to property rights of several Salesian foundations, documents that were crucial in a court case. Remember, communism was beginning to make pressure in China. As was my habit, ever since our martyr bishop died, I put this problem too in his hands. One night I awoke to note that the light was on in the office adjoining my room, as I could tell from the door, which was partially opened. I grabbed to switch it off, but I stood transfixed as I entered the office. There by my desk was Bishop Versilia standing, dressed in the Chinese outfit he had started to wear when traveling in the last months of his life. He was smiling and silently led me to the place in the office where the long-lost documents were. He then said in Chinese, as if reading my thoughts, "You are not dreaming. Are you with God in heaven, Bishop?" It was all I could say. I was so beside my mind. "Yes," he replied in Chinese, "from the instant I was killed." And it disappeared. And the light in the room began to dim. It was then that I noticed the electric light was not on at all. The light had actually been part of the vision. Now we leave it to the researchers in the paranormal to find an explanation, but I think there is an easier one. Back to our subject, oh my goodness. Here is a question we might ask ourselves. What is the main, if not the only reason for the crisis in the religious life? Is it possible that we may have been placing too much blame on secondary motives, overlooking the most important ones? Have we been wasting too much time and energy on the external structural reforms of our religious life, and probably ignored the interior character or structure of the soul? In his impressive work, Free and Faithful in Christ, Bernard Herring concludes that recuperating the genuine values of the gospel, in other words, a return to the total Christ, is at the core of the problem. Should we not courageously face up to the fact that we did not become religious Salesians in order to be successful educators, but in order to follow Christ, to be like he was, poor, humble, chaste, to be in this world, but not of this world, bearers of hope and love, men of prayers, men totally committed to the values of the gospel, weary of worldly efficiency, worldly methods and values? Is it possible we are forgetting that first and foremost we must be other Christs? If so, how is this primary goal to be achieved in our life? Live in me as I live in the Father, Jesus says. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who lives in me will bear much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. This union with Christ, this identifying with him, is the one reason of our vocation. St. Paul is obsessed with this idea. Mi vivere Christus est, for me life is Christ, and who or what can ever take him from my heart? Read the life of the saints. They were all literally centered on Christ. Augustine wept at the thought that he had known him too late. St. Benedict wanted his monks athirst for Christ. St. Francis of Assisi was not happy until he directed every thought of his friars to the crucified Lord. And when in a vision to St. Thomas Aquinas, Jesus told him, You have written marvelous things of me, Thomas. What recompense would you like? None but you, O Lord, Thomas replied. And when St. John of the Cross was told by the Lord that heaven would soon be his, the great mystic replied, I have my heaven already to suffer and be despised for you. But Christ-centered saints we have in our family too. Our founder, lost in contemplation, in ecstasy, actually during the Mass, and more than once. St. Mary Magdalene was still a young girl, unable to go to church either before or after a day's hard work in the fields, looking out the window to the church tower to send her heart's message to the Lord. St. Dominic Savio in ecstasy before the tabernacle. Venerable Andrew Beltrami, who tormented by asthma, and Father Alfonso told me it was a sight to literally break your heart to see Dom Beltrami in the last months of his life. Tormented by asthma, spending his nights on a chair in the gallery overlooking the sanctuary at Valsalice. And we mentioned it, Bishop Versilia kneeling in prayer in a cold chapel after midnight. I skipped Father Binelli. The time is too much, but I could tell you things about Father Binelli, his posture in the chapel, his breviary most of the time offered in the chapel. Unbelievable. But there is a little parenthesis here I cannot skip. We used to be a little bit of rascals sometimes. Father Binelli had one weakness. He loved to play chess. And whenever he played chess and was engaged in his favorite game, he forgot everything else. And we would purposely go to him to ask for special permissions at that point. He would look up, he would not even look up to you. Go, yes, you have my permission. Occasionally we'll enter into trouble. Who told you to do it? He would ask post factum, you did, Father. Remember, you were playing chess. You rascals, you would say. This saintly man, as good as bread, with the simplicity of a child, when it came to formation, we have said it already, went straight and strong to the basics. To a former novice of his, he wrote shortly before he died, you ask me what it is that matters most in our life as religious and Salesians. Briefly, that Jesus being the center of your life, always present in your thoughts. Our love for him is the sole guarantee of our fidelity. Jesus expects you to love him and asks you, in fact, as he asked Peter, do you love me? May you always be able to say, like Peter, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Being Christ-centered is crucial to our life as religious and Salesians. And we should pause during these days and reflect if it is really so, or if we are not relegating the Lord to a second or third place in our everyday performance. And we must be very practical about these questions. Do we view the practices of piety as somewhat marginal to our work, perhaps even an intrusion, an unwelcome addition to our busy day? How often do my thoughts run to Jesus? Who was that beautiful Episcopalian minister who wrote a delightful book? I read it quickly once and I even forget the name of the author. The title of the book is Run With Me, Jesus. Now here is an Episcopalian minister who gave his life, I think it was, to the gay community and the drug addicts community in New York. And he was so busy that he had no time to pray. So he would tell Jesus in the morning, run with me, Jesus, for the rest of the day. The decree of Vatican Council on the renewal of the religious life, Perfecta Caritatis, in its very first article, puts Christ in the center of the life of every religious and of every religious family. This, the degree specifies, is the supreme norm. Every religious institution must make its own. I leave it up to you. Shall I continue, or shall we add to this afternoon? It would be worse this afternoon. It would be warm. On November 22nd, 1962, here I go again with my personal recollections, but be patient. It was my privilege to be present at a private audience granted by Pope John the 23rd. I did not raid the audience myself. I just was in the company of one who did. He and I grew together. In fact, even at Valdocco, in Lu, my native village, our native village, and then at Valdocco. At the end, we parted the ways. He went to the diocesan seminary, and I became a humble Salesian. What else? As it happened, this friend of mine entered the Vatican diplomatic career and was promoted to papal nuncio to Japan and consecrated archbishop. The day following his consecration, he was received by Pope John the 23rd. Notice this was 1962, a few months before the Pope died. One could see that he was not well, but he was in great form. He congratulated the new archbishop, reminisced about his visits to our village, where he said I had eaten the best tasting grapes and drunk the headiest wine ever in the world. Well, he continued, now I am a prisoner here, but I have lots of company, the bishops present at the council. It was the first session of the council. They keep me busy. And then he began to talk about the council. Now notice, there were 4 or 5 or 6 of us, but he was in a talkative mood, the good man. And he said, you know, people have strange notions about the council, but the council is really many, many things. For instance, the council is a great big sieve. You know what a sieve is, I'm sure. As a little boy, I used to do my share of sifting on the farm. There were no machines then, and the corn flour had to be sifted by hand. For hours on end, holding a sieve almost as big as I was, excuse me, he said this, he made a joke, much bigger than I was. Of course, he said, not now, because he was a big man when he was speaking. I kept at it until I ached all over. The fine flour went through the sieve. The husks will be discarded for the animals. The councils will do that too, among other things, the Pope concluded. Separate the fine flour from the husks. I am sure you know what I mean. And Bernard Herring, quoted before, sees in the defections that have plagued the Church a purifying process. Pope John said, in other words, he is convinced that a great many defectors from the diocesan priesthood and the religious institutes were men and women, for the most part no longer tuned to the values of the gospel, whose life no longer centered on Christ, but on the values of the world. Outwardly, if I may say, there could be no more successful community than the religious sisters of the Sacred Heart at Manhattanville College near Portchester. Some 78 or 80 nuns literally bask in the prestige of that college, whose pupils numbered young women from the most famous families, the Kennedys, and, as I think I mentioned, the Crown Princess of Japan went through her college there. Being fairly close to the community, since I was occasionally confessor and so forth, I could see what was going on. The community reflected, the sisters, the atmosphere of the college, an atmosphere that was certainly not one to encourage poverty, humility, and self-denial. After all, those young girls were to be prepared for a glittering world. And so all too often worldly values took precedence over more important ones. The nuns were mostly from very wealthy families themselves, many with a long list of degrees after their names. They lived in a world that was the world, and not the convent, traveling far and wide to all sorts of conventions and seminars. Surely this was their way of building the mystical body of Christ. Why not? Although not all the sisters agreed. When in 1960 the new $2 million chapel was erected and the great crucifix enthroned on the altar, one thoughtful nun said, "How utterly incongruous that crucifix. What's it doing up there if he is not in our heart?" Now listen to this. By 1970, the community had disintegrated. The nuns turned to other activities, many of them keeping to the vows, while most of them left the order. And so Manhattanville College, the pride, the showplace of the religious sisters of the Sacred Heart in the United States, if not in the world, is no more. It is now a state college, the great chapel, mostly used as a concert hall. The same fate befell to nearly all their establishments in the United States. The nuns that have survived the storm are regrouping with a totally different lifestyle and a new program in which glitter and a sophisticated approach are replaced by the total gospel.